Class trials, one of the peaks of Danganronpa, and such a significant element when it comes to music from the series. When you think of music from Danganronpa, you might think of Debate Scrum, Rebuttal Showdown, or Heat Up. And they're so important because they feature in one of the most significant elements of the entire series, figuring out who's committed a murder. And so for this video, what we're going to do is a basic explanation of the class trial music, and in particular, what makes a class trial theme? Are there similarities across them? And also a deep dive into individual themes to understand how exactly they're constructed. So if you're making your own, what sort of things you'd have to think about. But before we begin, you know what I'm going to say, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're almost at 5,000 subscribers, and once I get there, I'll start uploading covers and compositions to Spotify, so with your help, we'll get there very soon. Now, there are a huge range of Danganronpa class trial themes, so for this one we're going to focus on 5 of them in particular. Trial Underground, Class Trial Dawn Edition, Heat Up, M.T.B, and Climax Reasoning. Of course, there are various other themes, but we're going to cover them in future videos. It's worth saying that this video will mainly focus on the first trial from Danganronpa 1, Trigger Happy Havoc, so spoiler alert for that trial, but if you know the series, you've probably already encountered that trial already. There are various different similarities across many of the class trial themes, from small phrases which are repeated again and again, to instruments and sounds which are used and modified in many different themes. But we're going to focus on 3 big similarities and key themes across many of the class trial themes. The first one, and the most obvious one, is the use of instrumentation. It's no surprise that Danganronpa starts with music which is much more melodic and harmonic in nature. It really sets the tone and establishes a sense of environment for the entire game. The daily life themes, for example, are piano-based, typically, with a melody being played by the piano, harmony supplemented by various different instruments, but the key feature is that piano throughout. Then we move on to the investigation themes, which set an entirely different tone, with it sounding much more groovy and smooth, and instruments like the trumpet providing the melody. And finally, the class trial themes, which, as you can expect given the situation, are much more intense and chaotic in nature, which makes sense because everyone's screaming at each other throughout the entire trial. The instruments tend to be electronic based, such as synthesizers, and you have this drum machine kick providing a steady rhythm throughout many of the pieces. The second key theme is minimalism, which features in many of the class trial themes. This idea of certain rhythms being used and repeated again and again and occasionally modified. And we'll see how that progresses in many different pieces as we continue this video. And finally, if we dive even deeper than that into the music, the core of the music, we get into the final key theme. Music which isn't particularly chordal, but instead relies on rhythms and steady pulses throughout. In fact, in many of the class trial themes, there only tends to be about 1 or 2 different chord changes, which is a complete contrast with the daily life themes, for example, which have chord changes throughout. But it makes sense because the daily life themes are supposed to provide a sense of tone and environment, whereas the class trial themes are supposed to put you on edge throughout the entire thing. But musically, we now have a bit of a problem, because typically when you think of incredible music, you think of the beautiful chord progressions and the underlying theory that might be associated with it. But here we have music which simply revolves around one particular chord. Okay, fair enough, we might have the occasional key change, but the point is still the same. How do we create music which is really interesting, intense, and creates the tone and suits the mood of a class trial without having these elaborate chord changes? And to answer that, we have to go back into the second theme, this idea of minimalism. Now, I'm not describing the pieces as being minimalist, as that refers to a particular genre of music, but what I am saying is that many of the class trial themes take notions and ideas of minimalist pieces, this idea of a rhythm that repeats itself and constantly changes and evolves, and also the idea of adding layers upon layers of instruments to reach an ultimate climax in the end. Take Heat Up, for example. The piece largely just revolves around one chord, D minor. But let's hear what it would sound like if I started adding these elaborate chord changes and things like that, how it might change the entire feel of the piece. Now it sounds okay, it sounds like it could be a piece of music. Some sort of Danganronpa class trial jazz lounge or something like that. But it doesn't sound intense, it doesn't sound like it should fit the actual class trial. So let's take a step back and explore that second theme in much more detail. And to do that, let's discuss the individual pieces. Now usually when I do this sort of thing of breaking down individual pieces, I give a breakdown of the key musical facts, so the key signature, the BPM and things like that. Because that will take a while for 5 tracks, here's all the information in about 5 seconds. The trial begins with Trial Underground, the piece that plays in the main menu when you take that deep breath just before the business begins, the trial actually starts. For anything like me, you completely forget to choose your skills, so you spend a minute of time just listening to the track and then just starting the trial. But the key thing here is this ability to create suspense and the feeling that something immense is coming, and it does this by doing exactly what we've been talking about, layers upon layers of incredible music that stacks upon each other, rhythms that evolve and change over time. So let's examine a simplified version of some of those rhythms. We start with the basic rhythm at the beginning of the track, nothing too complicated yet. Let's then introduce that pitch shift at the first note. Let's add some reverb and delay for effect. And now the rhythm changed slightly. We introduce a new instrument to the entire mix. That second part now begins to change. An additional change. And that essentially summarizes the entirety of Trial Underground, a series of different rhythmic changes and instruments being added and taken away to eventually reach a climatic ending. And that ending leads straight into the second track, Class Trial Dawn Edition. Now really, I personally mainly associate this track with that little speech that Monokuma gives at the beginning of each trial, explaining everything that you already know before the trial actually starts. And musically, it follows a very similar pattern to Trial Underground, a simple rhythm that evolves over time. Okay, we have the cheeky little addition of a key change in this particular track, but generally speaking, the pattern, this minimalist style and idea that I was talking about before, stays exactly the same. Like Trial Underground, towards the end of the piece you have a prominence of percussion, but generally the basic idea of a simple rhythm that evolves over time stays the same. Then we move over to a track that you hear so often throughout the entire game and the entire series of Danganronpa discussion heat up. I really like this track. It's a good example of simplicity executed incredibly well. It shows that you don't have to do something complicated and with amazing chord changes and things like that to have something which is really solid and intense and keeps you on your feet throughout the entire trial. To start with, you have those rhythmic elements. You have the kick and the percussion as a whole, which provide the steady pulse and foundation for the entire track. There isn't too much variation in the percussion elements, and they're quite repetitive throughout, but they don't need to change. That's the most important thing. They don't have to vary, you don't have to have major adjustments or repetition. It keeps a steady pulse throughout the entire track. Now, standing out above all of that is the main melody, which is simplicity at its finest. It's literally just a D minor scale, ascending and descending, avoiding the B flat. There's nothing more to it than that. Combine that with the second section, which includes that 8 hours sample.
So how's about we put 8 hours on the clock and start that thing from now?
And you have discussion heat up. Simplicity executed incredibly well, and it just goes to show you don't have to do anything fancy for a piece to sound absolutely incredible. The main complexity of the entire track is created by exactly what we've been talking about. Adding, removing instruments, changing things incredibly subtly, but not necessarily having massive chord changes and things like that. I know Heat Up is a particular fan favourite, so if you do want me to go into this track in a lot more detail and really bring out all the nuances and small details, let me know in the comments. Now we shoot closer towards the end of the trial. Now I know M.T.B can either be after Climax Reasoning or before it, but for some reason when I think of M.T.B, I think it makes most sense before the closing argument, so we're going to talk about it now. M.T.B essentially acts as a rhythm game, and so as you can expect, the piece is incredibly simplistic in nature. But M.T.B acts as a bit of an exception to the rule that I mentioned for those previous pieces. On the one hand, yes, it's repetitive, and the rhythms do evolve slightly, but crucially, there is actually a proper chord progression for this track, albeit very chromatic and non-diatonic. Non-diatonic meaning notes that fall outside of the key. The effect of this is that it creates this feeling of unease and uncertainty and stress and tension is something that comes up in music a lot. I talk about it in the investigation themes video. So crucially, the fact that the rhythmic element of the track is very, very steady throughout. You have that kick and the clap that provide a steady beat throughout the entire piece. The melody of the piece doesn't change too much, it's very predictable, although sounds a bit chaotic, and I'm not sure why you'd want to dance to it in particular. But it's very reliable, it's consistent, and it's steady, and that's the thing that creates this ability to work for a rhythmic game. And finally, we get the opportunity in the class trial to pause and actually look back at the entire case from start to finish, putting all the missing pieces together and building a picture of the entire murder case. Climax Reasoning has an entirely different feel from every other piece that came before it in the class trial, even some of the pieces that I haven't spoken about, like Hangman's Gambit and the 5,000 versions of Heat Up. And so naturally it's the most melodic of all of the class trial themes. And that makes sense because it's trying to set more of a melancholic and kind of relaxed tone, and so melody will help this a lot more compared to the intensity and the fast-paced nature of the class trial themes that came before it, which aren't trying to be reflective, they aren't trying to achieve anything particularly special. They're going for intensity, punch, repetition, and a fierceness to them. This is very different. Now, as you might already know, the melody comes directly from New World Order, but in a different key this time, and slightly tweaked on occasion. As a bit of a side note, because I've been asked about this before, if you're interested in knowing what the notes in New World Order actually are, check the link in the description where I've transcribed it in a video. Now, although we have a difference here, firstly with the instrumentation, the first key theme, where we have the addition of a piano this time, which we haven't seen so far in the class trial themes, and the fact that there's actually a clear and fully developed melody, some of the key themes are still exactly the same. So key theme 3, for example, this lack of chord progression, still exists in Climax Reasoning. In fact, there are only really 2 chords throughout this entire track, E flat minor and E major. Now those chords on their own sound nice. Let's hear it on its own first. But the really important thing about Climax Reasoning is the addition of the B flat and the D flat to add a level of tension in the phrases. As you can hear, the addition of just 2 notes adds this additional layer of tension. It makes you feel slightly uneasy, like you're getting to the end of the trial, but you're not supposed to feel happy about it. And now if we replace that with some lovely warm pads, we hear the entire chord in action. In addition, we still have this consistency of rhythms and phrases which constantly repeat throughout. The only thing that really changes is the piano playing the melody. So even though we have slight modifications here and there, such as M.T.B and Climax Reasoning, the key themes are something we see throughout every class trial theme, even the ones that I haven't discussed, which I'll go on to discuss in future videos, from the instrumentation generally being electronic, to the minimalist and very simplistic nature of the rhythms and phrases, and finally, the lack of chord progression. The class trial themes have this amazing ability to take you on a musical journey, from Child Underground, which provides a sense of context and setting, and starts your heart racing a little bit. And then we move on to the intensity of tracks like Heat Up, Class Trial Solar Edition, Hope and Despair, M.T.B, and so much more, which provide this intensity and rhythmic pulse throughout the entire trial. As the culprit's getting closer and closer to being found out, the music is getting more and more intense, and eventually ends on Climax Reasoning, which takes a step back and is much more melodic and slightly calmer but melancholic in nature. There are many more Class Trial themes which I'm excited to discuss in more detail, and let me know in the comments below if you want me to discuss a particular theme. But for now, thanks for watching and take care.